Okay, welcome everyone. I don't know about you, but summer is going way too fast. I can't believe it's already July 21st. This is our second study group of July. Today we covered in our last session elderly and aging clients. So today we're going to cover the flip side of that. We're going to cover minor clients. So birth, pre-birth up until 18 years. So that's going to be what we are studying today. So I'm excited. I'll present on some content, some of the big things for the test you need to know about working with minors. And then we'll go through that for the big majority, and then we will always end with practice questions. But I see some new people. If this is your first time joining our study group, if you want to in the chat, just tell us that this is your first time. That would be great. If it's not your first time, welcome back. I'm excited to have you. I always love when people come for their first time, and you picked a good one to come to because this is kind of my wheelhouse. I've worked in schools for 13 years, so I love talking about this age group. So welcome to all my first time people, and welcome back to the people that have joined us before. I think the study groups are one of the best parts of the course because you get to learn in real time. We always utilize the chat function just because the nature of how big this group is. So if at any time you have a question, feel free to put that in the chat. If it's anything not pertaining to what we're covering today, you can always shoot me an email and I will reply to there. But today, if you have any questions about the content we're covering or anything that you think would be beneficial for the group, go ahead and put that in the chat. But I see lots of first-time people, which is really exciting. So welcome, welcome, welcome. I always start with just showing a brief overview of the course where you can find things. I'll spend about a minute on that, and then we will go ahead and jump in. So let me go ahead and share my screen. Thumbs up if you can see this. Great. Always good to know. And just a Zoom housekeeping thing, if you're ever not hearing the audio or not seeing, exit out and come back in. It's usually like a weird Zoom glitch thing, happens to everyone, and just try and reconnect. So this is what you will see on your dashboard if you are logging into the program. This is just like a test account, so it's going to look a little bit different than what yours is, and it's going to say 0% complete. But this is what you should see. Everything of our course is going to be on the left. That's going to be your dashboard, and it's broken down by unit. So if I close this, notice here, I click into each one to get to that unit. So it starts with getting started. Take these lessons in order. They're set up in order for a purpose because it kind of gives you those study skills first. Then you work on strategy, and then you get into content and practice questions, and you end with code of ethics and a practice test. So if you're ever wandering around the site and you're like, I want to look up ethics, you can use this search function. I definitely encourage you to use it because it will find it for you and it will open it for you if you're not able to find something. So it's actually very easy to find things if you use this search key. If you're wondering where our study groups hide or live, it's going to be closer to the bottom, live study group sessions. You click here, you pull this up. This is our PDF. I will have our August dates probably by the end of the weekend. I'm excited in August. Our wellness nurse practitioner is going to come on and lead us through a mind-body connection grounding training, which will be good for anyone, no matter where you are in the study journey, because she's going to work on a lot of techniques. And then past study groups will be housed here. You click here and all of our study groups appear in a Google Doc, and the YouTube link is here and any resources. So if there's a document, you'll be able to find it in here. So that's where you will find anything. Any questions on this? If you are ever, there has been, this is very rare, there was some issues just yesterday with the videos weren't loading. That was the server went down. So if that ever happens, just email me. We are going to have backups if that does happen so that you won't not be able to use the videos. We'll be able to send those to you. It's very rare, you know, technology. But if that ever does happen, make sure you email us so we're aware that something went down. So someone asked again, how do I get to the study groups? I'll show you again. So here's your dashboard. All the lessons are on the left. You can either search study group and it will come up that way. There's live is going to give you the dates and the link, and past is going to give you the past recordings. Or you can scroll down under live study groups. That gives you the Zoom information. Past study groups gives you the access to the past ones. How far back? This is all that I've ever done since we went on this platform. So probably a year and a half's worth. So I definitely encourage you to check these out. If you're getting closer to test day, there's tons and tons of information here. And you can kind of tailor it to what you need. So let's just click into it. Say you're like, okay, also notice at the bottom, here's 2022, but there's also 2021. So there's tons and tons. There's more than you could ever wish for. So say you're like, I'm taking the clinical, I really want to look at clinical questions. You just open the link and it will open for you. Okay, so I definitely encourage you to check that out. Let's jump into our topic today though, which is working with minors. So this is my wheelhouse, but what I want you to do in the chat is if you work with kids, tell me what capacity, if you've ever have, if you currently do, or if you're like, I work with adults and working with minors is not in my expertise. Go ahead. What level of comfortability do you have about working with minors? So some people are in schools, child welfare, trauma with children. Some people said I work with adults. This is not my comfort zone. That's like me on the flip side when it's elderly and aging. Just for reference, I work with elementary, but mostly like that 3 to 9 age group. So even teenagers is not my area of expertise as well. What's really interesting about any age group you work with, there's such a variety, right? There's some people that I see here working with very young children, and then some people working with teens. Huge range, so many different skills, so many different levels that children are at within that range, right? 0 to 18 is a huge chunk of the population. And that's a huge, think of everything that happens from the time you're born until you're 18 years old. So there's a lot to talk about with minors. So keep putting in the chat different areas that you've worked in with children. We're gonna just do kind of a broad overview for the test you will need to know, because there's gonna be questions. Like no doubt you will get questions about working with minors. That's a huge population. You might get some about school, you might get some about trauma, no telling what you'll get with that, but I can tell you will get some sort of questions about working with minors. So, now that we have that covered, when I say for test purposes, working with minors, what comes to mind? Put in the chat when I say you get a question that says you're working with a minor. What are some things you know you're going to have to think about? Consent. We're going to talk about that tonight. Erickson developmental stages, right? Mandated reporting. That's like, that you probably will see a question on mandated reporting on the exam. Age, Piaget, right? Think of that. Safety. Holberg, someone said. Tons of things that come up, but the biggest things we're going to cover is consent, mandated reporting, and confidentiality. Because we do have a right, some of our clients are going to have a right to confidentiality, but then there's some instances where we might need to break that confidentiality. So we'll talk around that too. I also say when you're working with minors, you're almost never only working with minors. Like oftentimes there are family members, right? So you got to think of like the whole family unit, because oftentimes they have a guardian or someone that's in charge of making some of those decisions depending on their age. So family systems come into play a lot here, and parenting comes into play, or family relationships. So we're going to talk about a lot of different things today. So let's start with assent. There's consent and then there's assent. Two different things, but kind of get to the same point. So assent is when you are getting an agreement from someone who can't give consent yet, right? They're not yet legally able to give consent. They're not of a legal age, but you're getting kind of their permission to participate in an activity. So I always want to get assent from a client. I don't ever want to force a child or a minor to participate. So assent's important because it respects the right to self-determination, right? Someone asked, are these notes available? They will be available. Yes. If you want to take notes, that's just your preference, but you don't need to be writing down every single detail. So assent is that agreement that that minor is going to engage in some sort of activity. Why do we think assent is important? We can't get their, in some cases, we can't get their consent. We need parental consent, but why do you think assent? How does that help the therapeutic relationship? Why would this be important? Building rapport, right? I'm going to feel a lot more invested if I know that I had a say in this. It builds trust, engages with the client. Safe space, right? I think it also makes clients, our younger clients, feel heard. A lot of times I'll say, I'll hear them say, no one listens to me, or no one listens to what I have to say. So assent, I think, can give them some of that feeling like they have autonomy and independence. Gives them, a sense that they're a partner with you in this relationship. Informed consent. So, and we know that we have to have informed consent, but the age at which a child can consent varies state to state. So I'll ask a little poll here. And I just looked this up for purposes, what it is here in DC. Who knows and you can put what state you're in your state, do you know what age minors can consent? If you don't know, that's your homework for tonight, is to just look up, because you'll see here, it's going to vary widely. See 12 in Colorado, 14 to 17, 18 in some cases, 16, like notice that range. Some start at 12 and some go all the way to 18. So it really does vary by state. For test purposes, if you ever get a question and it says like, go to your state guidelines, that's going to be the correct answer. They're never going to say you work in Texas and what's the age. You don't need to know that. It's just always refer to the state guidelines. But notice here, as you're seeing in the chat, it's different ages for every state. And different, I was looking up for DC, it's different decisions are different ages. So there's some things that kids can do some health stuff younger, but then mental health, it's 16, but then in some cases, some children can consent to be on medication at a certain age. So basically all this is to say that it depends on the service and it depends on the state. What you need to keep in mind is if you are in a state where children younger than 18 can consent, you need to deem that it's appropriate for them to consent, right? So there's a lot of factors to take into consideration. What is their cognitive ability? Like, what are the circumstances, right? Because we don't just want to assume just because they meet the age criteria that that's an appropriate decision for them to make. So if that is you have to use your clinical judgment to make sure that they're capable. That's like the biggest word here. They're capable of consenting. Follow your state guidelines, basically, is what you need to know here. So if a minor gives consent for their own treatment, so they said, I consent, and it's a state where that's allowed, generally, if they signed off, their parents cannot access them without permission. However, if you're in a state where it's 18, parents have to sign off, if the parents signed off, they have a right to access their child's records. And I would say in most cases, if the parents signed off, they're going to want access to their child's records. Just from my own, seeing things in the field. However, big thing to know here, you need to cover this with the family, the child, the minor before you get consent. They need to know what will be confidential, when you need to break confidentiality. So this is so important, especially with our teenagers, because you don't want to not tell a client that you have certain instances where you'll have to break confidentiality, and then you have to do that, and then they don't trust you. And they're like, well, I thought everything I say here stays in here, right? It's really important that when you are going through informed consent, that they know what that means, right? So very, very, very important. Someone says children don't have access to their insurance unless they get it for their parents. That's why in a lot of cases, parents will have to consent. There are some places that will see children, right, without insurance, and there's different agencies, but in a lot of cases, parents have to sign off for insurance. So that can be tricky, right? They're going to have access to that. Notice this here. The older kids get, the more they move through their teenage years, they want privacy. So you need to let them know what will be maintained private and when you have to let a parent know, or what will be disclosed. So it's very important that parents know what's expected and teens know what is expected. We do not have to share every detail of therapy with parents, right? If parents ask, you can give like broad details, but you don't have to disclose every single word for word that was shared in session, right? Any client has a right to confidentiality at some level. So that's what's really important to know too. Parents, because I'll have some parents that like will call me after every session and they're like, what happened? And I'm like, well, here's some basic things, but I'm not going to give them a play-by-play of what their child said, right? That kind of defeats the point of building that therapeutic relationship with the child. So very important that not only does the minor client know what is going to happen with consent and confidentiality and privacy, but the parent knows too. I'm sure a lot of you that work with children have probably run into some scenarios where parents are upset because we can't share the details that they want, right? They want to kind of, some are overbearing and they want to know every detail of their child's therapy journey, which in some cases that's not appropriate at all. So make sure that everyone is aware what is expected. FERPA. So if you work in schools, you've probably heard of FERPA. It's the Family Education Rights and Privacy Act. And this is actually very important because parents have the right to do whatever they would like with their child's education records. So if they do not want certain educational records shared outside of the school system, it does not have to be shared unless there's like a court order or something. So I've had cases where it'd be very helpful to have the school record shared with an outside provider, but parents are like, nope, not happening. Under FERPA, they're protected. We do not have to release their education records, which can, I don't know how many of you work in schools, but when you get an incomplete file, maybe there was like an IEP is missing or important attendance stuff is missing and the parent won't, give you consent to see that from their past schools, it can be really tricky. So you want to try and explain to parents like what the information will be used for, but at the end of the day, if they do not want to turn over their child's education records, they do not need to. They don't have to, they're protected. They have the right to have privacy of the child's education record. Once that child turns 18, the student has access. It's now considered their right to their education records, so they can do with it as we please. So if you are working with some older students or non-traditional students, if they're adult age, they have the right, their parent does not have the right. But I don't think you'll be questioned on FERPA, but just good to know that they are protected under this act. Okay. In the chat, if you have worked in schools or with parents, any sticky situations you've had with not turning over records or wanting to have more information than you can give, go ahead, put that in the chat and I'll kind of read it for the group as we go on. But if anything came to mind of any sticky situations or ethical tricky situations, go ahead, put that in the chat and I'll share it with the group as they come in. Because I think that we've all probably had some challenging situations with parents. Informed consent needs to be considered ethically and legally. That's why the code of ethics exists. It's to protect us. So we have to obtain informed consent, right? That's in the code of ethics. However, minors, and we talked about this, they might assent or dissent. So assent is I agree, dissent is I do not want to do this. If a minor dissents, they do not want to participate, we need to document that and like discuss why, right? There might be some cases where they don't have a choice, right? They're either mandated or it has to be, or sometimes it's the nature of kids, like, right? You say you need to do this and what do they say? I don't want to do that. So it might take some finessing to kind of explain to them like why this is necessary. Or how many times do you have kids say, I don't want to talk to someone, right? That's our job then to build rapport, those type of things. So it's very important that we document assent and dissent. And if a client's very resistant, we need to work on that. We need to find ways to kind of break down that resistance. Okay, I'm going to read some of these tricky situations. Sometimes people said parents want the therapy more than the kids and they're forcing them to go, right? That happens a lot and it's tricky. Sometimes you have to really like work on building that relationship and sometimes you'll just have very resistant clients. Some parents do not have a great relationship with the school, so they don't want people either just like, it could be the opposite, right? They have a really good relationship with an outside provider, but they're weary of school, so they don't want to share information. Parent in school wanted child's information and they were given a summary, but sometimes they're like, I want more information. So there can be lots of different cases. Someone was wanting meds for their child who turned 18. When they turn 18, it's probably up to the 18-year-old then if they want to be medicated or not. So there's just a lot of sticky situations. I'm thinking of some situations where this happens. If you've probably ever had to call Child Protective Services, they come into the school and they say who, they come and they point, they come to the front office and say who reported me, right? And what do we say? That's confidential information. We cannot tell you, right? Like, because parents are upset and a lot of times they deduct that it's from the school that a call was made, but we can't even confirm or deny that. We just say, you know, we don't have any knowledge that we can share with you. You need to contact Child Protective Services. But I've had that so many times, parents come in and say, who is reporting me to CPS? So there's a lot of variety of different things as well. Or I've had some cases where they don't have a good relationship with the teacher and they say, I want you to have the information, but I want the teacher to only have the information on like a need to know basis. So I will not share that. If the parents request that, I give the teacher only the information that they need. So, okay. If you keep thinking of like sticky ethical situations with minors, go ahead and put it in the chat because I think that we all have a lot to learn from this. Okay, when you have practice questions on the exam and it anytime gives an age that's 18 or younger, this is what you need to consider. Always think about this. Safety of the client, which is in any question you read, any client. Is the client safe? So if the client is not safe, what do we know with minors? We're gonna probably have to break confidentiality to make a Child Protective Services mandated reporting claim. If a child discloses to you and they say they are being abused or you have any suspicion, you have to report, right? A lot of times it can hurt the therapeutic relationship, but we are liable if we do not report, right? So make sure safety and make sure your clients know that. I tell my kiddos, they're little, I say, anything you stay in my office, say in my office stays in here unless someone's hurting you or you're thinking of hurting someone, right? Even at the most basic level, kids get that. And I've had kids disclose abuse to me and they're like, the first thing out of their mouth is, please don't tell my parent. And what I say is my job is to keep you safe, right? I don't say I'm not going to call, like, I'm never going to promise something, a promise I can't keep. So if you ever in that situation, a good thing to just say is my job is to keep you safe. My job is to keep you safe. So safety is the most important. Age of a minor can be anywhere from newborn to 18 years. So you want to consider Erickson stages, right? Because a newborn is going to be very different than even a 2-year-old. A 2-year-old is going to be different than an 18-year-old. So those developmental stages are important. And it's important for you to note what would be like generally ballpark what's appropriate of that age. So what's developmentally appropriate? Is it appropriate for a 4-year-old to have accidents and be wetting the bed? To me, that's normal, right? Like that, I'd want more information, but if a 16-year-old is wetting the bed, that's going to be kind of a red flag for me, right? Like we would assume 16-year-olds have mastery of toileting at that age. So just things to think about. You might get some questions that actually give a developmental level that's inappropriate because that happens, right? That could be a red flag. So if you got a question STEM and it said a 16-year-old comes to see you and they keep wetting the bed, what comes to your mind in the chat? Go ahead. What comes to your mind if you get a question that says a 16-year-old is coming to you and is frequently wetting the bed? Trauma, right? That immediately comes to my mind. I'm immediately also thinking medical. Is something physically going wrong or going on with this client that they're having some sort of issue? It could be sexual abuse, right? It could be a variety of different things, but that's going to carry a lot more weight than, like I said, if a 4-year-old is like having a regression or is still not mastered toileting. So just things to think about is the age of the client, what's developmentally appropriate. I also see at the opposite end, kids very young, so like let's say 5 years old, exposed to very adult content, like maybe they're letting them watch programs or stuff. And what do parents say? They're very mature, they can handle it, right? So there's the opposite end too. A lot of times parents think my kid's mature, they can handle this, but like they might not know what's developmentally appropriate. No, it's not appropriate for your 4-year-old to be watching very violent things that involve adult graphic stuff. So a lot of times it's psychoeducation with parents. They just don't know what's appropriate or what's not appropriate. So it depends. Other things to consider: parent guardian involvement. Are the parents involved or do we need to involve them, right? There's some cases where we don't need to involve them. We got this handled at school, right? We can inform them, but we don't necessarily like if you've ever worked with kids, sometimes this is just developmentally appropriate. We don't have to tell parents every time something happens. So consent and assent considerations. Some instances, like you might, in some school situations, there's probably other settings where this happens. You don't need consent to see, like if a child drops into the counselor's office, we don't have to get consent for that because when they're in the school, there's some protections they can have. So just things to consider. Person and environment. How is the environment affecting the behaviors of the client? What would you consider if you got a question STEM and it says a child's really acting up at school, but the parents say at home there's no issues? From a person and environment perspective, what do you think would be some things to consider? Has a lot of behavior problems at school. Parents say we don't see any of this at home. What do you think we need to consider? Classroom structure, attachment issues, right? I tell parents all the time, school is so much different than home, right? So many more people around, peers. There could be learning disabilities. There could be cognitive disabilities, bullying, attachment with teachers, peer relationships, comfortability, right? Some kids do not do well in big settings like that. Maybe they're overstimulated in their environment. Maybe they're understimulated. Maybe they're very bored in their environment. So always consider the environment and how that's affecting behavior. Manifestation of behaviors. We know that behavior, if you don't take anything from tonight, take this. Behavior is a form of communication, right? When kids are demonstrating a behavior, whether it's positive or negative, they're trying to communicate something. So if a child is acting out aggressively, they're communicating something. Something is not settled with their nervous system, right? Maybe they don't have the words to communicate. Maybe something's going on at home. So manifestation of behaviors just means like, how are they expressing their problem? And go ahead in the chat. What are some ways children or teenagers or anyone under 18 might express their problems? What are some ways, some things you might see? Anger, aggression, yelling, lying, biting with our younger ones. I have a lot of kids that bite, crying. Then there's the opposite side, withdrawing, right? That's a big one. If they're starting to not being engaged, running away, disengaging. So maybe they're starting to skip school, right? Wetting the bed, not eating patterns can be a lot. So there's a ton of different things of ways behaviors can manifest. So we don't ever want to say behaviors are good or bad. They're just communicating something to us. So for test purposes, I will tell you the test answer, and then I'm going to tell you in real life, not test. So put your test hat on. If you get a question on this exam, should you report to CPS or not? You have to know if you have enough information to report. So I'm going to give you two scenarios, and you tell me, yes, you have enough information to report, or no, for the test. So for the test, you always want to have enough information first. So let's give you this example. It says a 7-year-old came in and they had bruises on their legs and they were limping. Do we have enough information to report, yes or no? Walk in, limping, have bruises on their leg. For test purposes. Test purposes. So for test purposes, no, we don't have enough information yet, because what if they were in a sporting accident, right? What if they have a doctor's note? So we would need to inquire for more information about what happened. We need to get more information. So just having bruises and limping is not enough for the test to report. However, when you're in a real situation, you kind of have that gut feeling if you know something's going on, not test purposes, right? So don't think of what would I do in a clinical situation when you get CPS questions on the exam. Just, do you have enough information? Now I'll give you another incident. You have a client that says, let's say the client is 6, and they said when they're bad, they get spanked with a brush. They said when I don't behave, my mom or my dad or my parent spanks me with a brush. For test purposes, what do we do? For test purposes, yes, because that's a disclosure, right? We are not going to say, tell me more about like how big is the brush and how does it hurt? Does it leave a mark? That's enough information for test purposes there. We're going to go ahead and report. So disclosure is always report. And if there's enough evidence to, like cigarette burn marks, I'm not asking questions about that. I've had kids with extreme burns on them. Even if it was an accident, I'm reporting it, because why are they near such a harmful, like why were they having access to an iron when no one was watching them? Unless, of course, they had like a doctor's note or they were being treated by a doctor. I had a kid once come in, tell me they were in a car accident that day with literally like scratches and burns, and the parent was not able, we tried to call the parent, they were not able to be contacted at all. We had to call CPS. The child was dropped off at school, right? They needed to be seen by a doctor. So we had to call CPS immediately because the parents could not be reached. We didn't know what was going on, and the child had visible marks. So we had to report it. We didn't know. Anytime that their safety is in question and you follow up with the parent and you don't have, they're like, they either make up a story or they, don't get in contact with you, you can report to CPS. Okay. Areas of development to consider. Cognitive development. Can they think, learn, process information, and reason? A 4-year-old's level of cognitive development is going to be a little bit different than a 14-year-old. So just know what's appropriate. I have had so many times where parents say, well, my 4-year-old would never lie. I'm not saying that the child's lying on purpose, but developmentally, sometimes they don't have the ability to think or learn or understand things in the way that someone older would. So think about what their cognitive developmental level is. And sometimes there's cognitive delays or language delays or something. So consider that as well. Social development. Are they able to form and maintain relationships with peers and adults? Some kids have really strong cognitive development, but their social development is not at the same level as their peers would be, right? Maybe they cannot read those social cues, or maybe they don't have the language. I see this a lot with kids that don't have the language. They have poor social development because what are they doing? They're going up and pushing kids or biting them to kind of communicate with them. Emotional development, learning what feelings are, emotions are, understanding how and when they occur, and finding strategies. Some kids are going to be really strong in this area. They're going to be very in tune with others. Some like are going to have no idea. It's like you really hurt your friend's feelings and they just have they didn't process for them, right? They are not really quite mastering the emotional development. Sexual development. We have to think about it at this age, especially in that puberty age, right? There's like some kids that are going to be in tune with their sexuality sooner than others. This is just a part of working with minors. Also knowing that sexual knowledge and beliefs come at different points for different kids, right? Like there's just going to be some kids that are more mature sexually and other kids that aren't. However, sexual development begins at birth. So think of Freud here. He goes through all of those different sexual development stages. It begins at birth. So know that it just develops throughout the lifespan. Cultural development. This is a child's awareness and appreciation of different people around them, diversity, different viewpoints, different opinions. Biggest thing I can tell you here with working with minors, it's impacted by their home environment oftentimes, right? You might have kids saying some really extreme, ignorant, hateful things, especially our younger ones. Think of where that came from, right? Where are they getting this messaging? Oftentimes they like are not, it's not coming to them on their own. It's probably from where they're raised, their home environment, what they see around them. This can be tricky. I've had some kids exposed to a lot of beliefs I personally do not agree with, right? I'm not there to tell parents how to parent their children, but parents need to know when they're in a school, their kids are going to be around different people, right? Like that's part of being in school. And sometimes you'll get some parents butting heads that they don't agree with. I mean, we're seeing this play out in our nation. Like they don't agree with the teaching that's going on. They don't agree with that. So sometimes the social worker has to give some of the psychoeducation around that. I've had some parents say, I don't like the social emotional curriculum the school's using. And it's like, well, this is what we're using. So either take it or leave it, those type of things. So just take this into account when working with minors. Okay, couple more things, and then we'll jump into practice question. When you get a question about a minor, we've talked about this, you always want to ask yourself, is this how most kids this age would be developing, or is this appropriate, or is this like probably not age appropriate? So I will give you a few situations and you tell me if you think it's age appropriate or not age appropriate. We already did the bedwetting one. So I've seen test questions like that. It says a 4-year-old is masturbating, playing with their genitals a lot, and the parent's concerned. Is it appropriate is it developmentally appropriate or not appropriate for a 4-year-old to be masturbating? That is very developmentally appropriate. If you've worked with this age, kids are learning about their bodies. Their hands are usually in their pants a lot, right? They're just like exploring. They might be asking questions about the world around them. For some parents, like this is like, whoa, right? Like what's going on? So it's just a lot of like educating them. Like this is appropriate. You did this at this stage too, right? So they can be awkward conversations, but they're just a lot of parents need to know. So that's appropriate. Let's see. How about a 6-year-old who has knowledge of sexual acts, knowing what sexual intercourse is and explaining it to peers, 6 years old. Appropriate or not appropriate? Right, not appropriate, right? That's like, what have they been exposed to developmentally that would not be something that is appropriate for them to be exposed to. It could even be a sign of abuse, right? Or that they're unattended and they're like exposed to different things. What about if you have 13-year-olds, let's say 13 or 14-year-olds starting to think about potentially using substances? So maybe they're drinking for the first time. What do we think of that? Appropriate or not? Age appropriate? Not is it the right thing to do, but what do we think? 13, 14-year-olds starting to maybe get some peer pressure to do some things that their friends are doing. Maybe they're drinking or maybe they're using substances. It's not out of bounds, right? That would be age appropriate. That's why we need to provide education. But we know at this age, kids are testing things out. This is when they start to be curious, and peer pressure. If their peers are doing it, they are probably going to do it. They're figuring out for themselves like what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. But what we need to do is let them know what the consequences are to these behaviors, right? Kids at this age, I mean, we've all been this age at some point. We don't think through what the consequences are. We think we're invincible. Nothing's going to ever happen. I'm on top of the world. So and that's developmentally appropriate too, is just thinking there's never going to be consequences or accountability for your actions. So taking all that into account is important too. Okay. When you need to consider if you need to protect confidentiality versus maybe you're in an ethical dilemma, you're like, do I tell parents? Do I not tell parents? Here's some things to think about. Is the minor proposing to do something that is not in his or her best interest? What is the level of risk? If it's something that is a very risky behavior, you need to consider, do I need to break confidentiality or not? I'll ask you, what if a student says, you know what, I've been shoplifting a lot and I think I'm going to probably steal a car this weekend and go driving. Do you think we need to tell someone at this point if they're planning to steal a car? Yes, right? What if they just say, you know what, I one time stole a candy bar and they're 14 years old and they said, I stole a candy bar from the convenience store. No, notice how those levels of risk are very different, right? Stealing a car versus stealing a candy bar. We're going to have conversations. We're not placing judgment on what is right or wrong and what the law is and what the law isn't. That's not what we're there to do. It's around providing education about consequences, level of risk, et cetera, et cetera. And knowing morally, some kids have a strong moral compass and some haven't developed that yet, right? So important to think about that. Are there consequences? Would a parent adult be expected to prevent a negative consequence? When I would say you should break confidentiality is if you think that their parent knowing, and by mean breaking confidentiality, tell the parent, if them being involved would prevent something really bad from happening, you need to tell the parent, right? We're not talking about stealing the candy bar, but if they are in a relationship with an adult who's sexually abusing them, we need to tell someone, right? So it's always considered the level of risk. Could other people be harmed by the client's decision? What do we know about teenagers and the way they think? Do they think really so much about other people, or is it all about what's going on with them in the moment? They're very internal at this point, right? They're not seeing the big picture. So we sometimes we have the luxury of being an adult, right? We have how many times when you were growing up were your parents like, you'll understand when you're an adult, and we're like, nope. And then here we are, we're adults and we understand now. So it's just part of growing up. They're very into themselves, and that's developmentally appropriate. The last thing you want to consider, what liability might you as the clinician be exposed to if you don't report and something happens? Always think of that. What's going to happen if you didn't report a child stealing a candy bar? You're not going to lose your license over that. But what happens if you knew a child was in a relationship with an adult who's maybe taking advantage of them and you didn't report? let's just use that scenario. You knew a teenager was involved with an adult sexually. They're probably being exploited. What could be a liability, or what could happen to that minor if you do not report? We certainly could lose our license, right? There could be legal consequences. We could face some sort of charges. The minor could be incredibly harmed. The minor's safety could be in danger. So things to think about is always, and this is what I always say, like sometimes you're going to have to make decisions that your clients don't agree with, but if it's to protect yourself and to protect your license, that's all you need to think about, right? Like we do not want to lose our license for anyone. So just things to think about. And it seems like these are like really like obvious, like of course, but if you ever have gone to an ethics training, they always give cases where people are not thinking in their, in the best interest ethically. And every year there's cases where people lose their license because maybe they were thinking like too much with their emotions, or they got too caught up in, caring for the client, or they kind of got too involved, right? Where like there's no boundaries. So always important to consider it does happen. If you're experiencing countertransference, process it. It's normal, right? I don't want people to think transference and countertransference are bad or negative. Like it happens. We can sometimes feel positive thoughts about a client. Maybe they remind us of someone we really like. You're going to have positive and negative. Just make sure you're acknowledging it and you're processing it. Any questions on that? Okay. Let's jump into practice questions. We have 3. If you're struggling with like consent or any of this, you always want to check the code of ethics. If you ever are like, I'm not really sure, go to the code of ethics, talk with someone. The code of ethics is like what we live and breathe by. So you can never review the code of ethics enough times. And unfortunately, the code of ethics leaves some gray areas. So sometimes there's no black or white answer. You kind of have to use your clinical judgment in some cases because there's no right or wrong answer in certain cases. Okay, practice questions. So for these, I'm going to read it. I want you, it's great if you get the answer right, but it's really about breaking this down, pulling out the key points that we need to. And then in the chat, you're going to give your answer choice and why you selected the answer you did. If you're between 2 answers, if you're like, I think it could be A or C, put that in there. This is just a thought process. Like no one's judging if you got it right or wrong. You're not getting graded on this. This is just for your own participation, for you to kind of get sense of what is going on here and some practice, because the more practice you can do, the better it's going to be on test day. So number 1, a grandmother meets with a social worker about recent behavioral changes in her 13-year-old granddaughter. The teen has become socially withdrawn. The grandmother is concerned the teen is hanging out with peers that are a bad influence. During the assessment, the grandmother states that the changes first appeared after they moved into a new home and the granddaughter began hanging out with the older neighbor. How should the social worker respond? Before you even get to answering, read this question on your own, and then I'm going to tell you what key parts we should kind of draw attention to here. So go ahead, read this on your own. And remember, if you have been utilizing the course, if you haven't gotten to the 5 W's yet, you will. That's who, what, where, when, and why. Always good to think about when reading a question. What stands out to me? Who's our client? The grandmothers who came to see us. And she has a 13-year-old granddaughter. So I'm also thinking minor, right? 13, teenager. What's typical of a 13-year-old? What's the presenting problem? There's some sort of change, right? She's now withdrawn. And what else has changed? They've moved. So there's a life event. So grandma's concerned because behavior change, and grandma thinks that like she's hanging out with these peers that are a bad influence. We don't know if that's the case or not. What else is happening here? She's been hanging out with an older neighbor. And this is asking us, how should we respond? So basically, grandma's our client. Grandma says, help, My 13-year-old, we just moved. I'm seeing some changes. How do we respond? A, the social worker should determine the age of the older neighbor the granddaughter is spending time with. B, ask to arrange a meeting directly with the granddaughter. C, explain to the grandmother that this is typical behavior in the social development of adolescence. Or D, obtain more information about the changes that occurred since the move. How would we respond to grandma? And remember, pick your answer choice and why you picked the answer you did. And remember, you might be between two answers, but which one best answers how to help the grandma, given the information that we have? Okay, let's start ruling stuff out. That's the best. We're not going to ask to meet the granddaughter. That's not what the grandma's there for. That does not answer our question of saying, let's meet with your granddaughter, right? So that's out. B is out. Now there's some people who have said A, some people who have said C, and some people that have had said D. None of these would be wrong, but some are going to be better. One answer choice is going to be the correct one, but none of these would be wrong in real life. But we got to think, given what grandma's come to us with, what do we do? Determining the age of the older neighbor the grandma is spending time with, or the granddaughter spending time with, not the best answer, because she's saying that she's withdrawn, the peers are a bad influence. We need more information, right? We might get more information that we need to ask the age, but that's not important at this moment. It doesn't say the grandma's worried that her safety is concerned. Those would be assumptions, right? We never want to assume. There's nothing here. It says she thinks they're a bad influence, but it doesn't say that she's, how many parents would say they think their kids' friends are bad influences, right? So nothing here that says the granddaughter's in immediate danger. So now we're between C and D. This could be typical behavior in the social development of adolescence, but why is D better? D is better because there was a recent life event, the move, right? So D is just better because of the move. We need more information. Where did they move to? Why did they move? What's going on? Like, did this child want to move? Was she forced to move? Like, we just need to assess what's going on with this move to get more information. She didn't say what these changes were, right? Did she just start living with grandma? Did the parent die? Like, there's so many different reasons why this teen, could be withdrawing. So we need just more information first. These other things could be correct, but to respond to grandma, we need more information, because also grandma might just say, maybe grandma is not used to parenting a 13-year-old, so teenager is withdrawing, right? There could be so many variety of things. So we just need more information first. So if you can get more information, you need to do so. Does that make sense? Okay, so notice the other answer choices weren't wrong. It's just given the information we have, we don't want to make any assumptions. So A would be making an assumption. We're not going to meet with the granddaughter. That's out. And this could be typical behavior, but I need more information first, right? Typical for what? Was she acting like this before? We just need a go a lot deeper. Okay, I'm going to bump this down to the next page. Number 2. A 15-year-old client has been meeting with a social worker due to a diagnosis of major depression and social anxiety. The client is wheelchair bound and has been having difficulty managing getting around the school building. The teen suggests that her disability causes her to be an outcast, causing her peers to look at her and gossip about her in the hallways. What would be the most appropriate response from the social worker? So you have a 15-year-old, some of the presenting symptoms, always important. So we have a minor. She has major depression, social anxiety, is wheelchair bound. So there's some sort of physical component to this. She has difficulty managing getting around the school, so there's some mobility issues. She feels like an outcast. Her peers look at her and gossip about her. This is a most question. What would be the most appropriate response? So when you get a most question, there could be a few answers that are correct, but you're looking for the one that will best answer what's going on in this moment. What's the most appropriate response? Educate the client on her rights under the American with Disabilities Act so she can advocate for herself. Assist the client in processing these emotions and help the client prioritize what issues she'd like to focus on in treatment. Report the behavior to the principal as the student may be experiencing bullying. Or D, provide the staff with psychoeducation on the child's condition and how the school can provide appropriate accommodations. What answer are you choosing and why? What's the most appropriate response? None of these would be bad, but what's the most appropriate given the information that we have? So let's start a process of elimination. Providing the staff with psychoeducation on her condition, how the school can provide appropriate accommodations. Does that get at her presenting problem in this moment? Not at this moment, right? That kind of does not address her depression or anxiety, how she's feeling. That could be a step later in the process, but that's not the most appropriate response. Educating the client on her rights under the American with Disabilities Act so she can advocate. Does that help her feel like deal with any of the feelings she's feeling to say, you have rights and let me tell you about what your rights are? No. So that would be out. She does have rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, but that does not meet her in the here and now. It does not help her process what's going on. Report the behavior to the principal as the student may be experiencing bullying. I don't think we have enough information yet. We need to understand what's going on. And the client has not said they want us to do this, right? What if we went to the principal and she's like, now I'm even more embarrassed because you went to the principal without, my permission, which that happens sometimes. We think as adults, this is what needs to happen. And then they're like, you've actually made things worse for me. So process of elimination, B is the correct answer. Assist the client in processing these emotions and help the client prioritize what issues she'd like to focus on in treatment. There's a lot going on here, right? She's having the major depression, social anxiety. She has a physical disability. She feels like she's not fitting in. So first we need to process with her and then help her prioritize, because there's a lot of different angles we could take with this client, but we want to hear what's most important to her at this point. Also, there are issues about her getting around the school building. Is that more important, or is these peer relationships? We don't know. The client knows. So B is the correct answer. Okay. Our last one for tonight, number 3, a 7-year-old client who was molested by a caregiver as a toddler is experiencing problems at school. So we know the age is 7. We know there's sexual trauma years ago, but now is having problems at school. The parents report the child is becoming aggressive with other children at school and is talking about inappropriate sexual acts. The mother is embarrassed by the child's behavior as other parents are complaining to the teacher. The social worker should explain that this behavior, so this is what I would say we talked about. This is not a developmentally appropriate behavior, but we have some context here. Sexual abuse as a toddler, and now they're acting out inappropriately. How should we explain this to the family? This behavior can be explained by A, may indicate the child is still experiencing sexual abuse. B, should be reported to CPS as it may pose a risk to the other students in the class. C, may be the result of the sexual trauma and should be addressed in treatment. Or D, should be discussed further with the child's pediatrician. How should we explain this behavior to the parents? Parents are so embarrassed. They're like, oh my God. How would you explain this to the parents? Would you say, A, is this child still experiencing sexual abuse? B, we have to report this to CPS. C, this could be a result of the sexual trauma. Let's address it. Or D, talk to your pediatrician. What would you say to the parent in the moment? And why? Let's process of elimination. Anything, do we have any information that indicates the child is still experiencing sexual abuse? No. So we're not going to say is like that your child may be still experiencing sexual abuse. We don't want to tell parents information that we don't know, right? That would be very alarming if we cannot say that for sure. So A is out. Do we need to report this to CPS given the information we have at this point that they're talking about inappropriate sexual acts and becoming unaggressive? Not at this point, right? And parents are aware, parents are trying to address it. So B is out. So we're down to C and D. Should be discussed further with the child's pediatrician, potentially, but we have information that we know, right? So I think if you took your child to the pediatrician and said they're talking about sexual acts, they're probably going to say, you should see a social worker. So they're probably going to kick it back to us because at this point, there's no medical thing that we can think of, right? So D is out. C makes the most sense knowing what we know about trauma. This behavior could be the result of sexual trauma and we should address it, right? Knowing that with children that have been sexually abused, it may come out at later points in life and there could be regression. So it's something that needs to be addressed in treatment from what the information is that we have. And parents need to probably, like, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. In the moment, it's probably embarrassing, right? But they just need to know that this could potentially be part of the effects of trauma, sexual trauma. And knowing that trauma just doesn't start, even though it was years ago, it can manifest throughout the lifespan. So just because, you know, this child was a toddler, or I've had parents say that was 5 years ago, they were a toddler, they don't know, they didn't know what was going on. Like educating them about what trauma looks like, how it can manifest, those types of things. Any questions about that one? Okay. I think we covered a lot today. I think this is a really, thank you all for having like such an engaged session. I love talking about this. I could talk all day about working with minors. The recording will be available tonight. I'm going to email it out. It will also be in those study groups. This sheet that I showed earlier, it will be down here in 2022 study groups. If you can't find it, it's on the platform under past study groups. You'll click it, you'll find it. August study group dates will be coming out soon. Next, we're going to have one on that mind-body connection. Definitely encourage that. And then I have to look what our next topic will be. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I hope that you found this helpful. I hope to see some of you again soon. If you're testing soon, good luck. If you have any specific questions, feel free to email me at agentsofchangeprep@gmail.com. I'll be sure to answer those for you. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I hope you have a good rest of your evening. Happy Friday Eve. Thank you, everyone.